my name is Eric Grosinger. I'm the pastor of student ministries at Faith Bible Church in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I'm excited to introduce and kick off our next series through the book of Jonah with you this week. You know, the book of Jonah, or at least the story of Jonah, is one that many of us are familiar with. You know, maybe it's from our time growing up in church and Sunday school, or through reading children's books and Bible stories at home to our kids, or having those stories read to us when we were kids. Maybe all that we think about when we think of Jonah is how he got swallowed up by a big fish for 3 days and was later spit out on the land. And while that's true, the story of Jonah is actually so much more than that. It's a story that actually reveals and underscores the power and the presence of God's unending mercy and compassion for all people, even people that we have a hard time loving. His forgiveness is available to anyone and to everyone who recognizes their own shortcomings and their sin and choose to follow him. And although this is a story with Jonah as a main character, the real story is focused on the mercy and the compassion of God. Well, with that in mind, let's jump in to chapter 1. You know, this chapter gives us an overview of how Jonah chooses to run from God and the consequences that caused for him. You know, specifically, the highlight in this chapter is Jonah's disobedience, which led to discipline. You know, we see this start off right off the bat in the first 3 verses that Jonah chooses to disobey and to turn from the call that God has put on his life. You know, as a prophet, Jonah was given the call to go to Nineveh and to challenge and to call the people to repent from their sin. And instead, Jonah chose to rebel and to let the people perish in their sin. Jonah's heart had lost the spiritual vitality, the urgency that really reflects the heart of God. You know, and Jonah, being a prophet who was called by God, really forgot what an incredible privilege and an honor it was to be a prophet, to be someone who would speak the truth that God wanted people to hear, and to give these people the opportunity to know the God who loved them and cared for them. Well, instead of choosing the heart of God for these people, Jonah chose his own heart of hatred and disgust, and he ran the opposite way. Now, to be fair, the Ninevites were enemies of Israel at that time. They were a cruel people who abused Israel. They practiced immorality and had a very polytheistic religious view with numerous gods and idols all around that they worshipped. They were a people who were far from being upright and pleasing to the Lord. It might seem unusual that a prophet of God, called to be his spokesman, would ever presume to run away from the Lord. But this first chapter of Jonah really shows us that the prophet had a good deal to learn about the extent of the Lord's mercy and his compassion. In fact, this narrow view that mercy had might just be a clue as to why he thought he could escape God. But the truth is, God called Jonah to Nineveh because he loved both Jonah and the Ninevites. God's compassion and his mercy, they flow freely from his heart, irregardless of background, the personal history of anyone, or anyone's personal merit. But it makes me stop to ask this question to myself. Do I have a narrow view of God's mercy? Do I believe that God extends that mercy to others, even those that I don't like? More personally, do I have a narrow view of mercy toward others? Am I hesitant to extend that mercy or that compassion to others, even though I myself have been the recipient of God's mercy? Well, as you continue on in this chapter, you begin to see how Jonah's disobedience ultimately leads to discipline. Jonah finds a boat, he purchases a ticket, and jumps on board again as an attempt to escape from the Lord. And then we begin to see how Jonah becomes more of a curse than a blessing. A giant wind and a storm come up over the water, and the sailors begin to panic, and they're starting to throw all their cargo overboard and crying out to their gods. And all the while, Jonah is sleeping down in the hold, oblivious to all that was happening around him, and oblivious to the truth that his disobedience was causing this challenge. At a moment when Jonah was called to be a blessing to the Ninevites, he now is ending up becoming a curse to them. And once the sailors found out that Jonah was a prophet and that he was running away from God, Jonah offers himself to be thrown into the sea, and the storm immediately stopped. The sailors were amazed, and they actually offered to make a sacrifice to God and to vow to serve him in verse 16. Meanwhile, Jonah is being disciplined by being swallowed by a big fish and staying there for the next 3 days. Jonah's wrong thinking led to wrong actions. Jonah's defiance to God's call led to his discipline. As believers, we're called to follow God's leading and direction in our lives, even when we may not feel like it's something we want to do. Maybe it's to forgive someone who's wronged us deeply. Or maybe it's to sacrifice our time or our energy or financial, physical resources. Maybe he's calling us to take that step of faith, to reach out and to engage in a gospel conversation with somebody else that God has put on our hearts. God desires for his compassion and his mercy for others to be seen through you and me. He shows that in Jonah 1 by asking Jonah to go to Nineveh and to call the people to repent. He also shows his compassion through protecting and guiding the sailors from the ship. How can you express the compassion and the mercy of God today in your life and around the people that you have interaction with? My prayer for you and for me is that we would have eyes open and hearts willing to allow God's compassion to work through us, to bless and to impact and minister to those we care about. God bless you. Have a great week.